Welcome to Common Code Presents Ethical Jobs. This is part of kind of a long-running series of presentations that Common Code does. Most of the time we do this internally. So Common Code Presents has been a thing where we can basically spread the word around the organisation about the outcomes and the learnings that we get from doing certain projects with our clients. What we're testing today, and what I think is going to be a great thing for the future, is the idea of taking this public and allowing people in our network and people who are part of our clients' networks to be part of the conversation and to hear some of the learnings that we get out of doing the projects that we do with our clients. And so today we'll be talking about accessibility, and we'll be talking about accessibility within the context of a project that we've recently done with Epical Jobs. Which is another business out of the local business economy. And Robyn will be speaking for Ethical Jobs. Robyn is the General Manager of Ethical Jobs, and we worked closely with Robyn to build some interesting technology. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to Robyn to talk a little bit about Ethical Jobs and what you do.
All right. Hi, everyone. Yeah, as Ash said, my name's Robyn. I'm the General Manager for Ethical Jobs. This is us. We live just a couple of blocks that way in Collingwood here in Melbourne as well. And yeah, today I'm going to take you on a really short version of our journey where we came and saw these guys here at Common Code way back earlier in the year with a website that has served us well, but I think definitely belongs in the legacy bucket. And yeah, asked if they could help us create something which was more fit for purpose, more aligned with who we are and yeah, what we're trying to create and achieve. If you haven't come across Ethical Jobs before, we've been around for about 10 years and we're a jobs board, so we're a bit like Seek, but we work exclusively with charities, not-for-profits, government organisations, peak bodies to find new staff for what they're trying to do. It's a self-service model, so they will post their roles on our site and then job seekers can essentially search the website. So our product is multi-sided, but the side that we worked on with Common Code was the job seeker side. So this is the searchable job listings. So to give you a bit of background about Ethical Jobs, we have quite a lofty purpose. Like, we're trying to do some big things. We're a small team, but we want to achieve a lot. We want to create social change, and we want to do that by helping organisations that make a social or an environmental impact. It's a criteria that we have for any organisation that posts with us, is that their sole focus or their primary focus is on either social justice or environmental protection regulation. And we want to help them do the best work that they can do by finding great staff and also volunteers. And by helping them attract and retain their staff. So as well as our day job, running a jobs board, once a year we also run a conference. It's called Not-for-Profit People, and that is all about, it's an accessible, easy to afford conference, runs for 2 days in Melbourne as well. And that's all about hearing from leaders in the not-for-profit space around attracting staff, retaining staff, HR best practice, and a whole bunch of other good things and cultural initiatives. And we also support them financially. So we're a social enterprise. We give back to our community. Every year we choose 6 organisations and we run a match donation campaign. So we match donations up to $25,000 and we choose small orgs who can really do something with that money. That will be the difference for them in any given year. And yeah, we're trying to create long-term changes in the job seeker market. That's the goal. That's the dream. So we want to change the way Australians think about work, and we want to have more people interested in finding ethical jobs. I've been on this journey myself. I had 20 years in the corporate sector, and then about 2 years ago, I just decided it was a bit hollow and it wasn't for me anymore. It wasn't the right fit, and I'm not the only one who feels that way. So yeah, we want more people to be able to go on that journey. So you know who we work with. We work with some really teeny tiny orgs that don't post very often and maybe only have 1 or 2 staff, but we also work with some of the brands that you can see here, which are probably pretty well known to everybody in the room. We've got about 5,000 charities who we actively work with in any given year. 235,000, I think it's 237 as of this week, job seekers who subscribe to our alerts. And so far this year, we've had 1.7 million users on the site. And we have over 25,000 jobs posted any given year. So we're on track to post about 30,000 this year. So that hopefully gives you a bit of an idea of the scale and who it is that we're working with. So when we started to think about redesigning our website, one of the really important things for us was making sure it was accessible. And I wasn't sure what the knowledge around accessibility was going to be like in the room, so I've just taken it right back to basics. So basically web accessible tools, they're designed so that people with a range of disabilities and either permanent or temporary impairments are able to use them more easily. So that could be visual, that could be through lack of hearing, it could be cognitive issues. And they're designed to be assistive, technology compatible, and every design decision should be made with a view to inclusion. They should be easy for people to use regardless of where they're coming from. I think one of the founding principles of the web is that it was kind of meant for everybody and to be as accessible as possible for everybody. This unlocks the web for a whole bunch of people who otherwise might not be able to get in there and participate. And I think that sort of participation and contribution piece is a really important thing and something which we were very passionate about making sure we did a better job of at Epical Jobs. Why accessibility mattered to us? So the internet's for everyone. And there's about 15% of people globally who have some degree of impairment, which would mean using the internet in a standard sense would be really difficult for them. So as an organisation, we want to make sure that we're speaking to 100% of the people that we could speak to and not excluding 15% just because we've used the wrong colours or we haven't made things clear enough, haven't made things compatible with devices to assist with accessibility. It also improves SEO and findability. There's a lot of search engines search on text. There's a lot of additional text that goes into making the website accessible. And it also supports social inclusion for older people. So when we have a look at the demographics of the people that use the Ethical Jobs website, we have a large chunk of people who are over 50, sorry, older people, but I'm going to put you in the over 50 bucket. And those people don't always have the best vision or the best ability to use technology or maybe have to use a different type of device. So it helps make sure that they can still be part of that and still use our site. We have a lot of older people looking for volunteer roles who want to do something in their retirement. They're not quite ready to stop completely. So that was another driver for us, for sure. We also have a large number of organisations in our portfolio who are disability service providers, and they're sometimes looking for job seekers who have a degree of disability or experience of disability so that they can relate to the clients that they work with in turn. So we need to be really incredible in that space. We can't sort of talk to disability service if we're not ourselves able to accommodate people with disabilities or impairments when they come to visit our site. So that was another really important thing for us, which was missing from our current site. And we're really passionate about social equity. So we want to make everything that we do as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. A bit of insight about the Epical Jobs business. We don't have very many metrics that we look at in our business. We're not driven by sales or margin or profit. We're a social enterprise. Our main metric is impact, and the way that we measure impact is jobs growth year on year. So more users, more people able to use the site and interact in a meaningful way with the site means more jobs posted and more jobs filled, which by our standards means more impact. So that's probably the most important point on that slide from our perspective, is making sure we reach as many people as possible and fill as many jobs as possible. The difference to an organisation that having one person with the right skills sitting in the right seat can make is unbelievable. We hear great stories every week from our orgs who've been able to find someone amazing to fill a role. And it's really important that they can access everybody in the community, in our job seeker community, and not just those who don't have some form of impairment. If any of you are familiar with the Ethical Jobs current site, this is it. You can see what I mean. It's a bit of legacy internet material. However, that being said, we've been fond of this site. It's done what it needed to do for us for a long time, and it's brought all those 5,000 organisations to us and lots of job seekers, 1.7 million of them, this year alone. So whilst it's not super accessible, it does all the things it needs to do. It's a search site. You can find jobs. So we've been pretty happy with it. But from an accessibility perspective, it definitely isn't to standard. There's lots of issues with text size, teeny tiny bits of writing. Lots of issues with not being able to tab through, not being able to drop down menus, not having very clear hierarchies of information, text size, and also some of the colour combinations. If I don't know if there's anyone in this room who's colourblind, but what I've heard is that they're not particularly easy to untangle if you have some kind of visual impairment. And also very difficult for screen readers to manage because of the way it's all laid out. So that's where we've been, and when we came to see Ash and the guys here, we sort of plopped this on their desk and we're like, we have an idea of what we want to do, and yeah, we're really, really pleased with where it got to, which we'll come to in a minute. It's not live yet, it's going to go live. I'm going to give an ETA of end of next week. Since we took it over, we've had some new team members come on, and some things happen which have meant it hasn't gone out immediately, but we're really excited to set it free on the internet next week. And yeah, in terms of our design considerations, I found some non-accessible infographics to demonstrate our accessible design decisions. There's so much, there is so much to sort of consider. I think some of the main ones for us to reflect on in terms of our current site and doing things a bit differently, doing things a bit better. Colours was the main one, so working more up here and less down here in terms of the colour palettes, using text wherever we were able to, and the right size of text and text hierarchies as well, so it was clear for people to be able to navigate. And yeah, sort of making sure that we've got, spoil the surprise next week. But yeah, I think we're just so pleased with where it's landed. It does a much clearer, much better job across the board. So this is the homepage, and it's instantly easier to understand what's going on. We've actually even, since I did these screenshots, tidied up some of the contrast on this writing, so that's clearer to see as well. This is a job page, and this is a search page. So yeah, all of it looking much closer to how it needs to from an accessibility perspective. And yeah, I think that is kind of the very short version of our journey from not accessible to way more accessible. And yeah, I think Ash is going to talk a little bit more, but I'm super happy to take any questions about Ethical Jobs, or I'm not a dev, but I can answer any of your other questions. So yeah, let me know if there's anything at the end. Thanks everyone.
Cool, thanks for that, Rob.
No worries.
So yeah, we will do questions at the end for any of the stuff that we've talked about. But I think what we'll get into now is sort of the common code experience of working with Ethical Jobs and delivering, the new technology and learning a lot about accessibility along the way. So what I will do is switch presentations. I want a broadly accessible chat about accessibility. Somebody pointed out yesterday that the cursive font that I'm using to do all the highlighting is kind of hard to read and therefore very inaccessible, which is kind of fun. But yeah, so I realised what I forgot to do, and Robyn. So my name is Ash Guy. I'm a technical principal at Common Code. I am a multi-time founder. I'm a full-stack dev. I do a lot of stuff in the tech space, and my role at Common Code is very in the tech space, but I'm also interested in the creative side and the business side of things, and I like to operate at that corner of technology, creative and business to solve people's problems. A little bit about Common Code. Common Code is a digital agency operating out of Melbourne. We do a lot of stuff in the tech for good space, a lot of stuff focused on startups as well. And so that's really our core focus at the moment. And so the opportunity to work with Ethical Jobs to produce some stuff which was ethically minded and working towards positive impact in the world was a great opportunity for us. This, as I said before, this event itself is the first of possibly a bunch of public events that will talk along these lines and talk to some of the learnings that we've had with different clients. So if you enjoy the stuff that we're talking about today or learn anything, please engage with us and come along to the next ones, check out the meetup, all that sort of stuff. The other thing is, before I get too much into the detail, I'm going to take a little bit of an aside. I am exhausted. Common Code works a lot has been doing a lot of work in the Pacific at the moment, and I am just back from a 3-day trip in Tonga. I have been up since midnight. And so I have eaten very little today. I have drunk a bunch of coffee in the last hour, and I'm drinking a beer right now. So if I start rambling, feel free to throw soft things at me, but I'll try to keep it concise because we have a hard deadline when the transcription stops. So thank you, transcriber. Yeah. Cool. So Ethical Jobs came to us, as Robyn said, about sort of mid-year.
Probably.
And what they brought to us was not only this legacy system, which was sort of 10 years of investment in their technology and a lot of things that had delivered a lot of value over time, but also some great ideas that they'd been working on for a couple of years. So they'd been really investing for at least 2 years, I think, in sort of working internally with the group and figuring out what would work well for them and sort of running an internal process to understand what would be a great new generation of the website. What sort of website would deliver the Ethical Jobs message and the Ethical Jobs mission for the next 10 years. And so it was sort of a giant generational step. The previous technology was made up of a bunch of different things, as Robyn said. So there's a back-end PHP sort of application which runs all of their internal, another front end that focused on the desktop site, which is the one that you saw there. So basically what our job was to bring all of these together and implement something that, and that tech team had a lot to do. They were implementing new features, maintaining the systems that they already had. So what Ethical Jobs were trying to do was reach out to a partner who they could rely on to deliver a platform that was not only something that their clients would enjoy, but something that their internal tech team could use to continue to develop sort of at that high level for the next 10 years. So yeah, there was a lot of decisions that had to be made to enable that to work at those two levels. What I'm going to try to do is talk more to the accessibility side of things now, and I think I'm going to focus on, well, initially trying to convince you that accessibility is a good idea to focus on. So I think what I'll talk to you about first is 3 rather good reasons to be accessible. So there are 2 really obvious reasons to be accessible, and Robyn's talked about a bunch of this stuff, but what I want to do is take it a little bit further and talk about sort of some of the technical implications of some of the things that Robyn said. But the obvious reasons that I'm kind of going to ignore is A, not being a jerk. I mean, you want to be able to get as many people onto your platform as possible and not exclude people. You don't want to be building a business that is pushing people away or building tools that push people away. I mean, if you're building internal tools or applications, you still don't want to be able to be the sort of business that is disqualifying a bunch of potentially skillful candidates because they can't use your internal tooling because you're not building accessible tools, right? So, A, not being a jerk, but B, there's also the government aspect, the legislative aspect, the legal aspect. There is this is a well-tested, so in Australia, there is actually a requirement under the 1992 Disabilities Act that affects basically web accessibility. So it is a requirement if you're running a business to be able to offer your software, your services, your products to anybody, despite any disability or impairment, if you are able to do so. So the reality is, this has been tested. There's a really good example, which was the 2000 Olympic Games, where this was tested, where somebody actually put a complaint in about the Olympic Games website, and they couldn't access a bunch of stuff because it just wasn't up to scratch. It didn't do the most basic accessibility guidelines, and they ended up winning. and yeah, the Olympic website, despite spending a lot of effort to try to make this thing accessible during the court battle, over the course of 12 to 18 months, they ended up losing the battle and paying out to this chap who was really trying to establish that accessibility on the web is actually a really important issue for a lot of people. But those things don't necessarily, they're not forcing functions. They don't force you to build accessible software. What I want to talk about is three things that really should make you want to build accessible software, even if it's harder, even if it's going to cost a little bit more, but it's going to give you a lot of other benefits. So number one, accessibility is not just for the blind. So when we talk about accessibility, we're often conjures up images of accessibility ramps and guide dogs and these sorts of things. Extreme impairments that are stopping people from navigating the world and that are really obvious to us. But not all impairments, not all levels of accessibility are targeted at the most extreme impairments, right? Let's do an exercise. How many people in the room are men? Put up your hands. Okay, now put up your hands if you are either a man or you know a man. Right, so anybody who has their hands up right now, you might be interested to know that 1 in 12 men have or experience red-green color blindness. That means that 1 in 12 men do not perceive the world around them the same way you perceive it, and they do not perceive certain tools, like, for instance, a stoplight, the same way you would perceive it. Exactly. Let me give you an example. So let's talk about a scheduling application. Something you're setting up your timesheets for your staff, and you're going, okay, I need to find out if I'm going to be able to schedule this person. So you block your hours in, and you drag a nice little box, and you say they're gonna work from this time to this time. And what you're relying on in your tool is when it is compatible with their schedule, with their contract, it's going to give you a nice green background. And if it's incompatible with the contract, it's going to give you a nice red background. It's a really easy little thing for somebody to build, and it's a really easy thing to immediately think that you're going to be able to communicate that to your users. But you can immediately see the problem here. If you are red-green colorblind, you are not going to be able to tell the difference between the first case and the second, and you're going to have a hard time. It's either going to reduce your ability to use that tool quickly, or completely prevent it. Yeah, that's just one example. This happens universally across all technologies. If you're not thinking about accessibility as a major concern, you are going to reduce the ability for significant parts of your user base to be able to actually use your technology and achieve the things that you want them to achieve. Another example, which Robyn brought up earlier, is aging populations. Typically, aging populations have a lot of visual problems. One of the accessibility features that a lot of browsers have is that you can manage your font sizes. You can do high contrast mode. You might notice all of your parents using, on their iPhones and their Android phones, they turn on the large UI elements mode. So it looks really weird to you on their phones, but they need that to be able to read and navigate around the operating system, right? You can actually build things in such a way that those tools don't work. The ability to zoom those fonts doesn't work, and suddenly you're disqualifying a large portion of your user base from using your tools, right? So those are two simple examples, but basically the idea is that not only, no matter what your tool is, your target audience will include somebody who has some degree, or could include somebody who has some degree of inability or condition that will prevent them, that is not visible to you, that you don't understand. And so by building things in an accessible way, you are maximizing the number of people who can use your tooling, who can access your website, who can buy your product, but you are also increasing the speed at which they can do it and the ease at which they can do it. So you're increasing your conversions if you're building something that needs to sell lots of products, for instance. Or you're increasing the number of operations you can do if you're building an application that's used internally to, produce some outcome in your business. So accessibility is not just for the blind. Number 2, most computers are more impaired than most humans. So when we're thinking about building technology, building websites, building applications, we're usually thinking about building it for some particular user group. You'll have your personas written up and the user group will say, hey, here's my example persona, it's John, he is this age, he's got all of these different characteristics. But the thing that we don't really consider often is that John, when he's using your tool, will often have support as he accesses your tool, your app, your website, from a bunch of assistive technologies. What I'm talking about is the browser. The browser will read ahead and it will perform certain operations on your website to understand if John should be using it. Often people are using things inside corporate networks. So your proxies and things are going to analyze the content on your web pages and try to, and might block your content entirely if it's not readable in a certain way. The other obvious one is obviously SEO. So John might not even be able to find your tool because it's not listed on Google. Everybody accesses Google before they access websites directly these days. In order for something to be listed on Google, it needs to be understood by Google, and Google is basically a bunch of robots trying to read websites. So if you're building things that are not accessible, you are building things that cannot be read by impaired humans perhaps, but also robots, also the machines, because they are terrible at understanding the technology that we're building, right? A great example of this is the current thrust towards voice search in the US. So there are some statistics going around that say basically a significant portion of search in the US now is through Alexa or Google searching through voice, right? Google Home. So all of those systems rely on data that is scraped from websites to be able to match whether or not the thing that you're looking for is the thing that they're asking for, right? Or the thing that you're offering. And so if those systems can't scrape your website, can't understand the data, can't take different parts of your website and understand the relationships between them, maybe the relationship between your About page and your Products page, then it won't be able to deliver an experience that's accessible to those people using voice, which means it's never going to be used by that large segment of the population, that growing segment of the population that is using these voice tools. In fact, that voice technology is the exact same technology that people are using today to navigate your website or your application when they can't see the screen, when they don't have a screen. It's the exact same technology. It's using the same backing services that produce the same sort of representations of the data on your site, just in a different way. So there are many different cases where technology is going to have to consume your website, it's going to have to consume your application, that's going to support the end users of that application. And so building in accessibility allows more hinting, allows more an easier understanding for that technology to be able to understand how to navigate and how to consume the data that you're trying to give it. Number 3, accessible software is fundamentally better software. So this one's a little bit more philosophical, I guess, but it's got some really practical impacts. So I'm not talking about good here, I'm talking about the quality of the software. building accessible software causes you to think about the way you architect your software in such a way that you need to understand the relationships between the things that are going on your screen, the relationships between the interactions and the way you present them to your users. The way that forces you to build your software is the way that we are recommended to build our software every day. It forces you to componentize what you do. It forces you to be able to make or to reuse and to test small pieces of your software such that you end up being able to build something that is maintainable over long periods of time, much more easily testable over long periods of time, and it also disqualifies certain sort of classes of software that you can build. It prevents you from building things that are really complicated and contrived and reinventing the wheel that doesn't include all of that background accessibility functionality that you get for free from your browser. So taking accessible patterns into account and the accessibility that's given to you for free through your browser, through web standards, you end up with fundamentally better software that saves you time in the long run, eliminates tech debt, or not eliminates, but reduces tech debt significantly, makes maintenance much easier, makes it much easier to onboard the next person onto your project because it becomes much more obvious the relationships between the things in the components in your application are expressed in such a way that the computer can understand it. So anybody coming into the application should be able to understand it as well. So accessible software tends to be fundamentally better software. That's not to say that it's easy to go back and change software that's not accessible to make it accessible, but there are things that you can do to start to improve it. But if you're starting a new project today, this is a really big thing. Right, so those are three things which sort of build on the stuff Robyn's already given us around why Ethical Jobs thinks that accessibility is a key part of their business, and three reasons why you should start to think about accessibility as a core part of any software that you're building into the future. I've got like 10 minutes more, so I quickly want to run through just some quick ways that everybody in the room can start doing some accessibility stuff now. This is trying not to be too technical. This is trying to analyze situations where accessibility hasn't been implemented in a very good way, or at all, where there are deficiencies in your software, and how to identify that and how you can start to improve it over time. Yeah. So the basics. These are the things that you would have heard of already if you've done any accessibility type stuff before. Check your websites and apps against the WCAG guidelines using a checker like A-Checker. A-Checker is a tool that was written in 2008. It was an early tool for just checking all of the basic things that a simple script can do to make sure that the things that you're building are accessible. That's a really easy one to do. You log into the site, you point it at your application, and it will give you 20 things you need to fix, and it'll tell you how to fix it, right? You don't need to think about that too much. Very basic. Number two, using Google's Lighthouse plugin. So Google's Lighthouse plugin is part of the Google Developer Tools. Lighthouse was originally a tool used to help SEO for websites. It then turned into a tool to help optimize websites to make them easier to access over slow connections, that sort of stuff. Then turned into a tool to manage mobile sites and make sure that your sites are optimized for that, for the mobile platform. And it's eventually become a tool for analyzing whether your sites are compatible with the progressive web app style of application, which is a specific style of mobile website, compatible website that can be used offline and that sort of stuff. Because it's got that legacy of different levels of checking, it can check, a whole raft of different things for different devices and whether or not it's the things that you are building are built to be used in those spaces. So naturally, using the Google Lighthouse plugin, you'll be able to identify key things that are going to prevent you from, that are making your websites inaccessible. It doesn't always directly line up with the accessibility standards, but it does give you a bunch of stuff that will help make things, if you pass all of the Lighthouse plugin standards, your site will inevitably be more accessible. The third basic thing is to turn off JavaScript. One of the big trends in today's world, or web world, is that we're building more and more technology that reinvents the wheel, that builds applications on top of JavaScript that runs in the browser. Because we're reinventing a bunch of wheels, we're creating custom components that do certain things, we're throwing away a lot of the work that's been done to create accessible technology over the last 20 to 30 years in the browser, in the standards. We are just implementing our own stuff over the top. If you really want to get an idea of whether or not you are building a website that can be used on screen readers and used on different devices, used in low bandwidth situations, a great idea is to turn off JavaScript in your browser and try to achieve the same things that you can achieve when JavaScript's turned on. The key deliverables of your website or application. Can you still sign up? Can you still log in? Can you still purchase a product if you're a website? Or can you still, deliver that key value that you're looking for? If you can't, you're probably building with technology, or components of your system could probably be simplified and could probably be made in such a way that more people could have access to them, be that employees or your marketplace. So those are the three basics. Very easy things to do right now. Intermediate. This one I talked about earlier, zooming in and zooming out. There's a whole bunch of different settings inside your browser that you can fiddle with, that people use to, when they have vision problems, they have all these sorts of things. Contrast settings, those sorts of things. Changing fonts. A lot of people with certain visual situations can't read fonts that are highly cursive, which I talked about earlier in the, those sorts of things. So play with those settings on your website. Imagine that you were in a situation where some of these things were hard, and then see what happens when you actually do that. So see what happens when you zoom in. Make sure that you can still do, as I said before, all of the key things that your website does, all of the key things that your application does. Because if you can't, you're creating problems for yourself and you're creating problems for your users. Color blindness tools. Color blindness tools are fun. They're a great way to talk about accessibility. Obviously none of us can, if you're not colorblind, you don't know what it's like to be colorblind, but a great way to sort of start down the track of understanding what's going on is if you log onto the Google Store, you can download color blindness tools and apply certain classes of color blindness to the websites that you view. So you can browse through Google image searches and go red, green, colorblind and see what happens to all your stoplights or all of your images of fields and forests and trees. I did this exercise with my old boss, and basically went through and identified he volunteered that he was colorblind, and we went through and we identified exactly which type of colorblindness he had, and then we used that for him to communicate to me the sort of experiences that he was having when he was driving around and having to identify shades of color to identify whether or not something was red or green. And how things like shadows and lighting can affect the shades and therefore make it really hard when you're driving around in autumn in the US with at a stoplight. You just got this multiple levels of problems going on. So it's a really cool thing to play with, and it's a really good way to express to people around you some of the big problems that you get from building stuff that's not accessible. Number 3, navigating your website using only your keyboard. So this is something we used to do a lot in the past, but with great touchpads like you get on these MacBooks and all sorts of fancy mice and all this sort of stuff, we tend not to use our keyboards to get around websites anymore. But all websites have the built-in ability to tab through all of the interactive elements on the site, and sort of everything that you can do with your website, you should be able to do from your keyboard. The technology that drives that ability is the same technology that raises sort of the interactive elements to screen readers. And so if you can navigate your website just using tab, just using your keyboard, you'll find that those same interactive elements are available to your users, right? So it's another nice way of identifying certain parts of your application or website that may not be usable by somebody if they were using a screen reader, for instance. Bonus marks. So there are 3 levels of sort of acceptance when you build an accessible web application or website. There's A, there's AA, and there's AAA. The Australian government tries to build all of their software to at least an A level. The reason a lot of people don't go for AA and AAA is you've got to do a lot more work to make it happen. But things like making sure all of your audio and video content has transcripts has benefits for SEO, huge benefits for SEO. And that's one of the things that's required to get a AAA rating. So it's a lot more effort along the way. We're doing it right now with our transcription services, which we've already talked about. But if you can do that, what you're doing is you're producing a way for people to be able to consume, a second way for people to be able to consume the same media, right? And it doesn't necessarily need to be people. It can be applications as well. So in this case, it will allow for all of those keywords, all of those themes that we're talking about today to be linked to the content, to be linked to the website, to be linked to the rest of the site, the brand, and future presentations that we do. Number 2, build your UIs using component libraries that back on accessibility checkers. So one of the things that we spent a lot of time doing with the Ethical Jobs project in particular is in order to make things usable by their development team, we used a platform called Storybook. Storybook allowed us to build individual components which could be used across the website. But each of those components had a backing tool that allowed us to see the accessibility of that component in isolation, which is really cool because then when you make a change, you can get an alert to tell you that you've made a change that's actually breaking the accessibility of that component and therefore breaking the accessibility of every single page that uses that component, which is really cool. Last one, and I'm aware that I'm out of time, but getting your ARIA on. So when you get to the point where you can't build things using the standard web technologies, and you are building a lot of JavaScript stuff, there's a standard called ARIA, which is the Accessible Rich Internet Application Standard, right? So what this allows you to do is to take all of the concepts that are used to define the accessibility on the standard HTML components, like buttons and checkboxes and things, and apply it to your custom components. It's a bunch of extra work, but if you look at things like the search tool, the big search box on the front page of the Ethical Jobs site, when you go to it when it's released in the next couple of weeks, you'll see that the benefit is that you can have large JavaScript custom tooling that is still accessible, still readable by screen readers, and still deliver on that accessibility promise. So that's where you go to when you can't go anywhere else, when you don't have the ability to take those standard HTML components and use them, which is sometimes. But ideally, you don't do that a lot because every single time you're using that, it's a very expensive operation. You've got to maintain that forever. So I would recommend starting with the basic componentry and only using your ARIA components when you have to. Last thing, of course, is just become an advocate for accessible technologies. There's a bunch of things that you can do. You can, obviously, when you're building software, when you're talking to your teams, engage them about accessibility, based on all of the benefits that we've talked about today. Not talking about accessibility is something that, the problem with accessibility is it's something that it's kind of invisible to you in your testing process. And if it's invisible to your conversation, your speccing process as well, it's probably the first thing that's going to disappear if you are in a crunch, right? Your developers are going to naturally go, okay, I can fix that later, I can build it up, and fix it and add it later on. The reality is if you miss out on building it the first time, everything becomes harder after that. So having the conversation when you're first building things, early on in the project, and continuing to have the conversation as things are built, including it in your standard reporting, standard sort of weekly rhythms, is a really important tool that you could be doing. The other thing is just taking presentations like this, talks like this, and showing them to your colleagues and just spreading the word about accessibility and the benefits that it can have above and beyond just being a nice thing to do. It's got some real tangible and real, valuable business side benefits as well. Cool. I think I'm going to end it there. Hopefully it wasn't too painful. Hopefully I didn't ramble too much because I'm exhausted. If you have any questions, we are happy to answer them. But for slides from either of us or notes or any other questions that you don't want to ask now, you can reach out on these to myself on ash@commoncode.io. We are Common Code is the Common Code general thing. And you can also find me on Twitter at the Ash Guy, and the website, ashguy.com. But you can also ask questions now with the microphone. So let's do it.
Right, I'm Wayne. Thank you. And I have a question about making your site work with JavaScript turned off in the browser.
Yep.
So if your application uses React, Angular, or any of these JavaScript front ends,
yep,
what's your recommended approach there?
The new Epical Jobs website uses React. It is, it's designed to use progressive enhancement. It actually uses a core framework called Next, which is a React framework that allows you to deliver a website that works, that is server rendered, but then procedurally downloads parts of JavaScript and executes them on a per page basis. So it actually reduces the page load time, and it also allows you to have that basic HTML version of the website that's fully SEO compatible, but also have all of the sort of experience benefits of having a fully JavaScript website over the top. It's also just a really good way to, it's an opinionated framework, and it really helps you deliver quickly on building really nice web experiences, basically. So I'm a big fan of Next. There's also there's similar projects in the Angular space, and there's actually a variant of Next that uses Vue as well, which is called Nuxt, I believe, by the same teams. But yeah, so I would recommend checking out those projects.
Just to clarify, the page rendered, you get the most basic view, and then it progressively gets bells and whistles.
So what it will do is it will load the page. So it'll go get the data on the server side. Mm-hmm. It will pull it in, and it'll generate the page as if it was being generated in your browser, and it will return to you using basic HTML elements with basic style, all rendered in, right? Then what it does is it creates different bundles of JavaScript, which are delivered to the user based on the page that they're on, the features that they're using. And it does all sorts of nice things like link tracking, so behavioral tracking, and if you are going to mouse over a certain link, it can pre-download pages, do all those sorts of things as well. But you do get the benefit of having the full React experience over the top. So once the page loads, it becomes a fully React application. So it uses the React server-side rendering stuff, to sort of hydrate your React app based on the HTML that it sees in the background.
Thank you very much. It was a fantastic presentation, and I'm really interested in the work that Ethical Jobs does. You mentioned that 1 in 12 men are colourblind, and about roughly half of the population is colourblind. So essentially about 1 in 24 people are going to be colourblind.
Yep.
We know that from Australian census data, about 12% of the Australian population does not have internet access. And it seems from US data that that figure jumps as high as about 30% when it comes to people that are over the age of 65, which you mentioned you have a large portion of people that do not, or that are older. And particularly in your space where you have people that would like to volunteer their time, for example, to work with an environmental group to do things like plant trees, having internet access is not crucial for that role. So you're talking about accessible technology, but there seems to be a large portion of your potential users that are going to be excluded because they don't have internet access, and you've built an accessible website. Have you built an accessible business?
I believe we've built an accessible business. Great question. Yeah, I believe we've built an accessible business. And I mean, I think all we can do is make our website as accessible as possible for people when they have internet access. And people who may not have internet access at home would probably be able to find a publicly available space, a library, for example, a common shared space where there was some degree of internet access. It might be slow to load, but our website has been designed so that even if they find themselves in a place with suboptimal internet speeds, they're still able to download and view a version of the website which would give them enough information to be able to navigate and find that volunteering opportunity with an environmental organisation that they're looking for. So we can't give everyone great internet, but what we can do is make sure that when they do have access to the internet, what we provide them with in terms of their experience online is as accessible as we're able to make it. And that's, that's something which we think we've achieved.
Are there facilities in your website to essentially allow an assistant or a sponsor that has good internet and can communicate with their elderly relatives or friends to help support them in finding ethical jobs for their friends and loved ones?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who has access to it through good internet would be able to, I guess, kind of print out areas. There's lots of PDF content. So, for example, you could download a job description, which was a PDF, also available in the body text, but a lot of our employers will provide a PDF version which can be then downloaded, printed out and shared with somebody in hard copy paper form. So we're absolutely not trying to make it difficult for people to have access to the core information around jobs. So that in a job context is always the job description and the application details. And most of our employers will provide both an online application method and a hard copy method as well.
That's great. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm curious, Robyn, you might have said it earlier, thanks for the talk, both of you, that's great, by the way, that you are aware that there's an audience that you may not have been serving with the previous website, and obviously there's a significant motivation to do so. I'm just curious, how do we intend to measure the difference once we launch this thing? How do we know that we're servicing them? And I guess, what's the anticipated value of doing that, and what do you expect to see once we go live?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously through our Google Analytics, we can see information, but Ethical Jobs also does 2 surveys every year to our audiences. So we do an employer survey and we also do a job seeker survey, and we get about 10,000 respondents to our job seeker survey, and what we would expect to see in some of those responses. That goes about 50 questions in the survey. It goes into a lot of detail about where people are, how they're using the site, what their motivations are for looking for a new role, and also some sort of basic demographic information as well. So we would expect to see some shifts in some of that.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Essentially, yeah, it does. And there was also part B, like Ash, you piqued my interest around the spike in traffic through voice assistant driven searches. Like is that like a secondary effect that will somehow help the market that you were trying to serve as well? Like, both you could probably answer that.
It's big in the US, and the US is a leading indicator of where we're going. It's the availability of the technology. I haven't got any stats on the local usage, but you could imagine that you would benefit from it as soon as, like, by putting the focus into building this accessibility technology now, you are going to benefit from it as soon as it starts to happen, if it's not already happening, right? So, yeah, does that sort of...
It's kind of an open-ended question. I think it answers it, but yeah. I mean, do you expect more incidental traffic through, say, voice-assisted searches, where because you've done this accessibility piece, which was a secondary effect of the effort, but
So not just
maybe you'll discover some traffic there.
not necessarily different traffic, but also not just different traffic, but different demographics, but different contexts for the conversations. So voice technology that we're talking about, like the Alexas and the Google Homes, are used in a very different space than computers. They're not a single person sitting in front of a laptop. They're people in a room with possibly some family members around. It's speaking to your situation where you might have an elderly person or somebody who doesn't have a computer themselves sitting in the same room as you. You can ask the Alexas of the world, the Google Homes of the world, the Siris of the world, to tell you about the ethical jobs that are available to them. And with this technology available, with this technology built in, the idea would be that over time, it could just read you back that information. And so it's more conversational, it's more in the moment. And so it kind of puts the information on the website, the job data and the availability of these jobs, in the places where you need to have those conversations.
Thank you, Ash.
Thanks both. Really great chats. I'm interested, in this case it seems that Ethical Jobs, you worked with a designer that had a bit of a background in accessibility and design. Seems like a lot of the outcomes are achieved by both design and development. But I'm curious, and this is kind of aimed at you, Ash, if you're working with designs that aren't necessarily taking into account accessibility, what can developers do in their part of the bargain?
Yep. So there is a whole spectrum of things that you can do from a technical point of view to make things more accessible. Just because a design doesn't necessarily look accessible doesn't mean that you can't get a lot of the other benefits of making sure that your images are properly alt tagged and that you have your written text versions of your videos and all that sort of stuff. As a developer, you're also the one implementing the things, so the way you implement it can affect how the design is consumed. So often when you get a design, you'll get a version that is rendered for a certain sort of frame in the designer's mind of the experience that they're expecting the customer to have, right? As a developer, you're building an experience that spans the entire experience. Every single frame to the left and to the right. Every single click before that and every single interaction. You're handling mouse overs, you're handling failure states and success states, and all of these things that might not be covered by the designer. And so you have to make sure that where you're making decisions that improve the accessibility, that factor in accessible outcomes into the technology. So yeah, there are lots of opportunities for developers who are cognizant of sort of accessibility and accessible technologies and the methods to implement stuff, even if the design doesn't factor it in. But I would also say that by becoming an advocate for accessible technologies, you can kind of push back and work with designers to make sure that they're building things that are more accessible as well. Designers like feedback as long as you're not, telling them they're complete rubbish. As long as you're working with them, they like to know, hey, here's another way to look at the problem that they're trying to solve. And here are some ideas based on my background in accessibility. could this be something that you could build into your designs?
And as a business as well, we certainly pushed back on our designer if we felt that what we were seeing wasn't where we wanted it to be. And he actually really relished the challenge of going away and learning something. You know, if there was something he didn't know or wasn't aware of, yeah, that was a really good dialogue that we had, and a great sort of learning experience as a partnership as well.
For this project, we sort of benefited from the fact that Ethical Jobs has spent 2 years focusing heavily on building a great design and really thinking out how these components went together, which allowed us to focus primarily on the technology and understanding the accessibility implications of the technology that we were building and how we were implementing things. Which was great for us because we could get really focused in on those details, and also, as I said earlier, the idea that we had to deliver something that all of these learnings that we were getting, we needed to make it really easy for their internal tech team to leverage those learnings and be, built whatever they build for the next 10 years, they need to be able to get that, automatically almost get accessibility built in to what they're doing, right? So we needed to make sure that everything that we were building, all of the components and all of the processes and the methodology that we were building behind the technology would make it easier for them to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, by the way, great talk, both of you guys. Okay, so like I feel like I'm just trying to figure out a way of explaining this, but let's say with solar panels, right? So solar panels, you had the environmentalists that were early movers and they picked up on solar panels, right? Even though it was more expensive because that's what they cared about. But what it made accessible to your average Joe is when it became affordable. And I'm just thinking it seems like accessibility bleeds over to the developer side and also bleeds over to the SEO side, right? Like search engine optimization, people that are managing that. And it feels like the SEO side of things, there's more motivation to adapt to it because it allows for ranking and that's what they care about. Do you think there's motivation within development that would motivate people, that are not necessarily like developers that don't have to work on an accessible site to do it anyways?
Definitely, but it really depends on how you think about the technology that you're building. So the benefits, the easiest way to make something accessible is to use old technology. The problem that we have is that developers tend to like to use the latest and greatest, the fanciest bits of technology, and they like to play with new stuff, right? So typically people don't like to pick up, this is why Java developers are paid so much money to maintain banking systems. It's because it's not fun technology, but it is stable and it does have all of these things in it for free. That's what you get from building things using that deliver server-side HTML and CSS. You get something that has accessibility built in because you're using buttons, you're using your H tags, header tags, right, in a proper hierarchy. You're doing things like using checkboxes, which, HTML form components, and each of those has its own accessibility things built in. So screen readers can say, hey, this is a checkbox which is currently checked and it's linked to this piece of data on the page. And you get that for free when you're using basic HTML and CSS. What's interesting about that is that's also way easier for a developer to build, right? If you don't get carried away and start building these with the latest and greatest technologies and focus on building something that's robust and simple to start off with, you're often going to get a lot of accessibility wins out of the box. And so and then when you start building your fancy stuff over the top, then you can start, putting your effort into maintaining that accessibility from then on. But, if you start thinking about your code in such a way that start with the basics, get that end-to-end thing happening, and make sure that you're using old technology that's already accessible, that already gives you stuff out of the box, if you look at that as the driving motivation, which a lot of people who spend a lot of time developing sort of wind back to eventually. You'll find a lot of old developers just want to build using old tooling. Mature tooling, basically. That mindset is how you can get low-cost accessibility that delivers on the promises and also is a great experience for the developer. The thing that, as I said, you're fighting against is this latest and greatest technology, shiny object syndrome that we all suffer from a little bit. But by providing more gateways for people to build small components of their applications with the latest and greatest, and to understand how it's affecting the accessibility of their applications and the websites, and how they can improve that using things like ARIA, and leveraging ARIA to sort of extend the accessibility into those parts of their applications. There's kind of an on-ramp there. But yeah, I would say that focusing on stable tech as a basis for any new project is really the sort of the developer side to it.
Do you have any advice for people who are looking for a technology partner to build an accessible website, like what questions they should be asking and what they should be looking for? Like in past jobs, I worked in the community sector for 10 years and I saw multiple times the organisation would want to build an accessible website and communicate that up front, and it would be agreed to, and then the product we were delivered wasn't accessible. So what should non-technical people be looking for?
I think a lot of people understand accessibility or have heard of accessibility. A lot of developers have some experience building some accessible technologies. I think the thing that I said earlier about it being invisible and something that gets discarded quickly, that's the real problem. That's the real reason that a lot of these projects start out with the best of intentions but never sort of come through at the end. So the idea would be, my advice would be to don't just ask about accessibility on day one. Build accessibility into each of your touch points. Make sure that you're asking about accessibility when you're viewing a page, when you're viewing a feature that's been added, and how that affects the accessibility, and talk about it then. And if you can, engage with the developers to make sure that they're thinking about it as they're doing development all the way through, basically. And that will necessarily mean that they'll push back on other things. If they're under a crunch, they might have to talk to you about descoping other stuff. But it means that you're going to get better quality code that's better, easier to maintain, and that will have the accessibility at the end of the day. Any more? Awesome.
Great. Thank you.